Welcome back, folks. Now, before the break, I was talking about how all of the problems that we face come from a single source, which is government. And that the reason this situation continues is ultimately because of we the people. Because we allow this government to do what it's doing. We allow all of our governments to do what they're doing. And folks, we do this because we've forgotten the position that governments actually play in our societies and in our lives. We've been taught to believe that our governments actually rule us, but they don't, folks. Our governments are actually employed by us to act as our administrative arm. We need government to provide us with such things as basic infrastructure, roads, schools, good education system, healthy food, cheap housing, all of the things that the government seems to be grossly inept at actually providing for us, with any degree of quality, I might add. But that's what we actually employ them to do. They're our administrative arm to ensure that the country runs smoothly. But through our corrupt education system, through the brainwashing we've experienced through the media, and just through the general socially accepted pecking order that we get taught to believe is real, we've begun to accept these governments as our rulers. But they're not, folks. They only have the power that we grant to them. I've spoken to you about this before. The governments have the power that we, the people, grant to them. We entrust them with that power, and we are the beneficiaries of that power that we grant to them. So the governments are essentially the trustees of the power that we give them. And simply due to the fact that these governments are now enacting legislation that effectively restricts and enslaves humanity, they're claiming things like pollution and global warming as the reason for doing this, and yet they're allowing the corporations that actually create these problems to continue with what they're doing. So they're doing this sort of stuff. They're also creating an extremely brutal police force. We are seeing our police of modern times act virtually like Gestapo and Nazis. Just by simple observation, one can see that the main job of modern police is certainly not one of protecting society or preventing crime, but is actually the job of enforcing law. No matter how corrupt the law may be that they're enforcing, they simply enforce law and they defend elitist corruption. They certainly don't address crime, because if they did address actual crime, then our governments would not be getting away with what they're doing, and the police would not be acting in the way they act. I mean, certainly they do have to put up with some pretty brutal circumstances. They get called to car accidents and all sorts of stuff that we actually employ them to do. But as far as brutalizing and terrorizing society and enforcing corrupt legislation upon human beings, they too very much operate in breach of trust, as they only get their power from the governments that we entrust power to. So everything these governments are doing, all the power that we've entrusted to them, is being misused, and these governments are constantly operating in breach of trust. So we need to address this. This is one of the biggest problems that we face, and nobody seems to be looking at things from this perspective, but that's the way it needs to be looked at. I know I've gone on about this before, but I think it needs pointing out again. I actually went to a movie presentation last night, and it was quite interesting. It had all different methods that we could use to build better housing, ways to have gardens all through rooftops and all this sorts of stuff, all really good ideas. But it failed to mention the fact that these are simply good ideas, but they are not things you can actually put in practice because of government. The government won't allow you to put these things in practice. There's many places all through New York that the government won't allow people to put rooftop gardens in, and you can go and buy a property somewhere, but as soon as you try to attempt to build something like a cob house or an eco-dome or an earthship, you find that there are council regulations and building codes to prevent you doing these types of things. So they're great ideas and they're great novelties to build one on your property, as long as you don't want to live in it or actually use it, because the government that's in place will not allow you to do so. So what we need is a workaround for problems like that. And of course the solution to that problem is to build community and build community awareness. Because one person will never be able to stand up against the system alone. But if the entire community sees the system for what it is and bands together to make a better world and makes that community work as a whole and work as one, then that will empower communities around you and it will spread out to other communities. So you need to have this grassroots movement happening to get these initiatives happening and get these eco-domes and these rooftop gardens and all these things going. But you need to be able to stand together against the councils and against the governments and re-inform the governments that they are actually our administrative arm and that we know what's best for us. We don't actually need governing. We simply need honest people to manage the infrastructure for us. That's what we employ them to do, and they're forgetting that that's what their place in society is. So that's how you have to address these things, folks. You can look at all of these alternative ways of doing things, and that's all very good, and all of these methods need to be employed. But you also need to address the problem that has created the need for you to implement these alternate measures. Because if man was left to be free, and if things were done properly to begin with, we wouldn't need to be employing any alternate measures. We would be free to do what needs to be done, without the hindrance of corrupt legislation that prevents humanity from being humanity and serves only to empower corporations and the controllers of the monetary system. Very few of these films ever address the money supply. And the money supply is truly the head of the snake, folks. The first thing we need to do to improve society at all is to take the interest off money. That's the first step. There's no point in trying to do anything within the constraints of the monetary system that currently enslaves this planet to debt. And that's exactly what it's designed to do, folks. The money system is designed to milk the wealth of the planet and transfer it into the hands of those who issue the money. That's what it was designed to do, and that is, in fact, its sole function. And just having this basic understanding of the money supply gives society the ability to be able to appraise its politicians using this yardstick. Because, quite obviously, any politician who is in power, who refuses to address the situation of the monetary system, is unfit to hold that position. It's as simple as that. There's no grey area there, folks. And I would suggest, and I've said it before, that any politician who has not yet spoken out against this interest-based money supply is either a criminal who works for an international banking cartel or is too stupid to hold the position that they currently hold. Or perhaps simply they're badly educated and they can only operate in a state of left brain. But whatever it is, they're simply not fit to hold that position, because by holding the position they hold and failing to address the damage that is done by this interest-based money supply, then they are and can be nothing else than part of the problem. And let's face it, folks, they're always part of the problem, and all they do is create problems. It seems like a nice little situation they've cooked up in Libya as well, while everybody's distracted with Japan. The United States and France and England have decided to declare a no-fly zone over Libya, while also flying in there and bombing Libya themselves. So according to them, it's a no-fly zone, only they're allowed to fly, and they're going to go in and bomb the country under the pretext of getting rid of Gaddafi. They're going to go and bomb the country to save the civilians, of course, the way they did in Iraq. They turned Iraq into a cesspool and an obliterated, bombed-out graveyard and caused the death of over 1.6 million people so far in order to save them from tyranny. This is, of course, wonderful Western logic. Only the leaders of the Western world could come up with logic like this, folks. This is, of course, logical fallacy. We're going to go in and bomb the country in order to keep it safe. Amazing. And people just seem to fall for it. The media presents it and cooks it up and puts a nice little ribbon on it and promotes it to the world, and everybody just cuts a slice and swallows it. It's amazing. And that just seems to be the way the world is these days. So yes, very interesting times indeed, folks. And on today's show, I've tried to bring you information, again, simply from my perspective. That's all I can really offer you on any of the shows. Looking at the Japan situation, I've simply tried to look at all of the data. I'm no nuclear expert, folks. I don't pretend to be a nuclear expert. I've had to do a bit of a crash course in nuclear reactors in the last week, just to try to understand what's going on myself. Admittedly, there has been a lot of fear campaigning with this situation in Japan, but it is a very serious situation, and it is definitely one to be concerned about. Not one to be in fear of, but it's definitely something to be concerned about. Now, do I believe America is going to experience a large amount of radioactive fallout? Doubtful. Doubtful that America will receive any major fallout because of the distance the country is away from Japan. But America is certainly going to get some of the fallout. There's no question about that, simply because of the jet stream. And where this radiation falls back to Earth will be determined upon the local weather systems. It will be determined upon things like precipitation. Obviously, one of the easiest ways for it to come back to Earth is through rain, and so all of these things need to be taken into account, but certainly there is going to be some amount of radiation reach America. There's going to be some amount of radiation reach Europe. In fact, the entire Northern Hemisphere will feel the effects of what's happening in Japan. Every country will feel it to a greater or lesser degree. But of course, the people who are going to feel it the most are the Japanese. It's very unlikely that northern Japan will be a habitable area after this event. And if the event does turn into a worst-case scenario and we see 6 meltdowns in Japan, then I believe it may be virtually the end of the country. I don't think Japan will recover from such a thing, simply because, as I said earlier, these are very large reactors, and they have the potential to cause a great deal of damage. And ultimately what I see this as being is a huge wake-up call for humanity. Folks, there is no safe nuclear energy. There is nothing safe about nuclear energy at all. The only reason it has even been considered safe is because it doesn't produce greenhouse gases, the deadly CO2. And folks, CO2 is not deadly. CO2 is one of the building blocks of life. At the presentation I was at last night with the film that I mentioned earlier, someone was saying we'd like to build a society that has a zero carbon footprint. Bring carbon emissions down to zero. And I thought, well, a zero carbon footprint will kill everything because the world needs carbon. It's one of the 3 building blocks of life. I don't believe man-made global warming to be an issue at all. I don't believe that man has anything to do with climate change. I don't believe that it is man that is melting the polar caps on Mars or causing a rise in temperature on Jupiter. I think that the culprit in all of these matters is the sun. I think the sun is going through a particularly active cycle at the moment, and it is heating up the entire solar system. And I think it's happening everywhere, folks. I think that it's probably even happening outside of our solar system. I believe the energy itself that creates all matter, the energetic universe itself, is rising in frequency. As frequencies rise, things get warmer. That's the way it goes.